Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's episode. I hope you're all doing very well. Today we have here Professor Todd McGowan from the University of Vermont. He tends to focus on the works of Hegel and Lacan and delves into, the intersection between the two. Over at the University of Vermont, he teaches film and cultural theory, and his works include Enjoying What We Don't Have, Capitalism and Desire, as well as Emancipation After Hegel. His two more recent works, The Racist Fantasy and Enjoyment Right and Left, are fantastic as well, as are all his other works. And thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. And just as a quick little thought, your book, Enjoyment Right and Left, I thought was a really funny title because a lot of people, I see this even in interviews, mistake it and go enjoyment left and right. So it's
Yeah.
almost something about the title itself evokes a slip. So it couldn't have
Yeah.
been more Freudian.
Yeah, that's funny. I didn't intend it. You know what? I probably intended the title to be Enjoyment Left and Right, but I just somewhere along the line it got changed. And so yeah. The slip is in a way like gets at my own desire because I originally had it like that. So that's kind of funny.
Yeah. So leading into this first question then, and it's actually related to the title Enjoyment Right and Left. Oftentimes, enjoyment is a very confused term that I find a lot of people struggle with. And when a person is unfamiliar with Lacan and reads the title, they see pleasure right and left.
Right.
Of
Right.
course, both the right and left wants pleasure for each other. So could you maybe like elaborate the difference between enjoyment and pleasure?
Yeah, for sure. So pleasure is in a way, pleasure and enjoyment are opposed. For, in Lacan's way of thinking, in my way of thinking, I think in Freud's way of thinking, although it's not as clear, Freud wouldn't use these terms. He doesn't use the term pleasure, but he doesn't use the term enjoyment. For him would be Genuss or something like. But he doesn't really use that often. But yeah, so pleasure is and Freud's definition of pleasure is even a little counterintuitive, but I think it's right. So pleasure is for Freud the getting rid of an excess excitation. So right, so I'm like I feel stimulated in some way, right? Like I feel hunger, and then I eat a big piece of cake, and I feel I no longer have that stimulation, that excitation of hunger, right? So that would be then there's the pleasure of eating it, and then the pleasure is ends when the excitation is gone. Enjoyment's the opposite. So enjoyment is the actual excitation or accept the way we're bothered, right? So enjoyment would be precisely this feeling of, oh, I really I'm craving a big piece of cake and I don't have like that for Lacan, for me, I think for Freud in a sense, that's what enjoyment means. So it's more one way to think about it. It's the trouble we give ourselves, right?
Mhm.
Like it's the trouble that we give ourselves that we could get out of, right? So we can. So I for instance, like I think this is a stupid example. So I decide I'm going to be fit, right? So I'm going to lift weights and it's not enjoyable, right? Like, or not pleasurable, I should say. It's enjoyable, right? Like it's not, it's painful. It's struggle, but that's enjoyment, right? Like that, like I didn't need to, I could have just sat in my chair or done aerobic exercise, kept it that way. But instead I do this thing that causes me trouble and I have to exert myself and do this thing that's unpleasurable. But
Mhm.
that's what enjoyment is. This too much trouble that we give ourselves.
So if enjoyment is that trouble that we give ourselves, does it only spawn out of like, the death drive, or does it spawn out of other?
Well, I think it could come out of other things, but I think you're right that in certain sense that is that this idea of death drive, which is this giving ourselves trouble, like causing uh, for Freud, it's self-destruction, but I think it's a wider concept than that. Like it's all these things that we do that, or like that's what generates that cause us to have to overdo things, right? Like to like rather than just head for pleasure, which you talked about in the beginning, right? Rather than just head for pleasure, we take a detour, and this detour through this trouble is a death drive. And I think death drive is the primary source of our enjoyment. Like, I think that's what it means to be speaking subject, is that your enjoyment goes through this detour of death drive rather than just obtaining pleasure by getting the thing directly, right?
So would you say then that like those who portray the masculine ideal on I don't know if you've heard of these characters, but there's these people on YouTube like David Goggins or Andrew Tate who proclaim that
Tate is.
They proclaim that you have to sacrifice all these different things, and then eventually through like all these different investments in work getting girls or whatever, you can finally be happy. Would you say that it's a false sort of goal because what you're aiming at is not that in itself, but the enjoyment of trying to get it?
Absolutely, right? Like, they're just using that as so they're giving this they're giving an alibi of pleasure for the enjoyment of all these things they encourage people to do, like give up or whatever, to get to that point. But of course, once you get to that point, you're just as miserable as you were when you started, right? Yeah. Like if you, I mean, is the person who, let's say, this sleeps with a bunch of different women, is that person feel more satisfaction than the person that just feels like they're alone and aren't with it? Maybe, but not that much more, right? Like it's still going to be just as, you're still in this, there's this Adam Sandler, I think it was a Saturday Night Live thing. He plays a travel agent, and he says, we can take you to Italy but we can't take you away from yourself. You're still going to be you when you get to Italy. So if you're miserable in the US, you're going to still be miserable in Italy. And I think that's a pretty good account of how death drive works, right? And how the ideal of pleasure we think like, oh, that's going to take us out of this, but no, you're still going to be stuck with you. And I think that's what I would say to those. I mean, they wouldn't listen to me, but that's what I would say to these guys. Like, no, you're not really going to but all those things they're having people do. I think that's why they're appealing to people, right? Like, they're appealing to people because they're giving people a way to give themselves trouble, and that I think there's something appealing about while not being conscious of it. And I think that's a key part, right? Like, they're allowing people to have this unconscious path to their enjoyment, while consciously thinking, oh, no, wait a minute, I'm going for pleasure. Like, I want to sleep with a bunch of different people. That's the pleasure that I want, right?
Yeah. So then how does the death drive come to fruition? Is it always present, or is it something that inherently comes out of entering the symbolic?
Yeah. So if you're a speaking being, you are a subject of death drive, right? Just to full stop, right? Like, so it's not because it's unconscious, right? I think this is Freud. So Freud comes up with this idea of death drive in Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 1920, and he does, and both Freud and Lacan insist on this, even though they're slightly different conceptions of death drive, that it's always unconscious. There's no way that, because death drive aims at failure, right? At trouble, at problems. Our conscious mind cannot accommodate that, right? Like, because if you do, like, let's say I consciously say, I'm gonna cause myself some real trouble. I'm gonna go out and get myself arrested, right? Like, that's trouble, right? But once I make it into my conscious goal, there's a certain pleasure in being arrested. Like, oh, good, the cop busted me, I'm arrested. So that's the problem, right? Like, you can't, once you make failure into your conscious goal, it becomes this mechanism of pleasure and obscures the role of death drive. So you can't make death drive conscious, but you also cannot escape it. So it's not like, I graduated from death drive, or I wasn't yet in it because I was just, no, it's like, once you're brought into the symbolic order, into the signifying structure, you're a subject of death drive.
And do you enter the symbolic during the Mir stage, or?
Well, that's okay. So this is a very good question, because I think many people have this understanding of Lacan that first there's imaginary, which you just described, Mir stage, then you're in the symbolic, and then maybe if you're go through psychoanalysis or whatever, you get in touch with the real. Okay, my sense is that is completely not true, right? Like, so as I read Lacan, his point is like Mir Stage is an imaginary for him, an imaginary process, right? But like he does locate at a certain time between 6 and 18 months, but he also says Mir Stage isn't just a process we get through; it's always ongoing because that's how the ego is formed and sustained.
Mm-hmm.
But he thinks he even says you're bathed in signifiers before you're even born, right? Like oftentimes kids are named before they're born, very common, or they're, someone, the parent will touch the stomach and say, oh, the little kid in there are the hope for all our future generations, whatever, right? Like, but it's always, there's a whole mass of signifiers. So it's not like, okay, you have to become aware of your position within the signifying order, but you're a subject of the signifier from the get-go, like not just from birth. I mean, this is not a anti-abortion claim, but even the unborn are subjects in a certain way, are subjects of the signifier, right?
Well, you've done it, Todd. Someone's writing the book already.
Oh God, terrible. Okay.
So then, leading more deeply into that, then what is the thing that is able to introspect into the self? What is the thing that's able to say that is me?
Right. So I think the history of Western philosophy, it's our capacity for self-reflection, self-consciousness, right? I think what psychoanalysis contributes is very interesting because I think from the psychoanalytic perspective, this I am, and Lacan, comes from Freud, where it was there I shall be. This is a famous line of his from the new lectures on psychoanalysis, new introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. But it means that when you see your unconscious erupt, you have to say, oh, that thing is me. That feels like a thing to me. Like it feels alien. It feels like, oh, that's not really me at all. For instance, I mean, the clearest example, it's maybe not the most sophisticated, but is the slip, right? Like I say, oh, I just, or this happened to me several times. Like I called my current girlfriend by the name of my earlier girlfriend, right? And I'm like, oh, I didn't mean to say that. Of course I meant you. I don't have any feelings for her. But I then had to think psychoanalytically about it. And it turns out I did have feelings for the former girlfriend, right? And this is so I had to say, like, no, that thing that I said wasn't me. That was me, right? Like that. So I am that thing that seems foreign to me, that seems alien, that seems most disturbing that I do. That seems like, oh, that's not me at all. That's where I have to say, that's me. So I think that you see that's a little different, maybe a lot different from this philosophical tradition that wants to say, no, it's this ability to reflect on myself. For psychoanalysis, it's the ability to encounter oneself in what one does. And I think it's a little, it's like in a way, the difference between thought and the act, right? Between this act of, but the act can be a spoken act. It's not necessarily a physical act.
Yeah. So then, this self or this I, actually, I should probably ask this first. Is there a distinction between self and I, or are they one and the same?
That's good. I mean, yeah, I think I'm not into this so much into this, like, oh, make sure our terminology is absolutely strict because whatever. I mean, people, but I do think self is a little dicey because as a concept, because I think it's a little too associated. You mentioned Mir Stage, a little too associated with ego, right? And I do think I think it's important to have a distinction between subjectivity and ego. And Lacan distinguishes between just the French words je, which means I, and moi, which means me. And what's interesting is moi means ego in French, right? So the me is also the ego. So for Lacan, at least. So that's so self, I think, is a little bit more on the side of that ego, whereas subjectivity is this divide between what I say and what I mean, or between what I believe about myself and what I do, right? And the subject is more on the side. So in a way, the ego is on the side of what I mean, whereas the subject is the split, but also on the side of what I actually say, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in pure psychoanalysis, you're not allowed to say, you say something in the analysis. You're not allowed to go, well, wait a minute. I meant to say. The analyst is going to say, well, I don't care. Like what matters is what you just said, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's because that's where, so when you say what I mean, that's your self or ego, right? But what you actually said, that's subjectivity. That's subject or
Yeah.
the I, right?
Okay. So then this I, does it change in accordance with the master signifiers it takes up? Or is the I strictly how you identify yourself through like bodily image?
I think it's neither actually, but
Oh,
I
okay.
do think so. I think that how you identify yourself through bodily image would be the ego, right? Like that's the ego.
Mm-hmm.
But how you uh, orient yourself vis-a-vis a master signifier, that I would call something like symbolic identity, right? Like that's your symbol, and your symbolic identity, I think you're right to distinguish, is not reducible to your ego, right? Like your ego is separate. Like I have a certain symbolic identity as, let's say, professor, right? That's not like my ego. I don't have any investment. So my ego is not that at all. So they're different. But subjectivity is even a third thing, right? Like and subjectivity is in Lacan's sense real, right? Like it doesn't it emerges through signification, but it's precisely this uh, point of failure or disturbance within signification. So it's neither. So the two things you just mentioned are symbolic and imaginary, but subjectivity is that third category of it indicates the. I mean, again, it emerges through the symbolic order, but it has this real dimension
Mm-hmm.
to it that I think is crucial because it's again the hiccup within the symbolic order,
Mm-hmm.
the hiccup within the master signifier that I identify with.
So then leading into the real here, a lot of people identify, for instance, there was a lecture that was given, and it was talking about how the real is the failure of the symbolic to
Yeah.
and they gave an example, for instance, of when you are an astronaut in space and you look down on the earth and you're at a loss for words, and that's when you touch the real. Would you say that's an accurate depiction, or would you
Yeah, that
disagree?
seems a little dicey to me because that seems like your loss for words is symbolic, right? Like it's
Mhm.
like everyone like they're because if you ask 10 people on the street, 9 of them would say, "Oh, I'd be at a loss for words," right? Like
Yeah.
so the loss for words fits within the like I think that to me my favorite example and the problem is that the people in the world are more and more not remembering this example because no one's as old as me, but not ever. So when the Soviet Union fell, when the Berlin Wall fell, Soviet Union collapsed, it was real, right? In the sense that no, to be alive at the time was to go, wow, like I can't believe that just happened. Like the I remember I was talking in high school since 1985, talking to a girl who was an exchange student from West Germany. I said, "Do you ever think there'll be a united Germany?" She said, "Just absolutely not. If anything, the only way it would happen is if the Soviet Union conquered us." Right?
Mhm.
So she just thought, "No way the wall's going to fall." And then 4 years later, the wall fell. Right? So that's to me, that's a great example because it's this thing that could never happen that then happens. Right?
Mhm.
So, but I think revolutions are the same. Right? Like the French Revolution, Louis XVI was like, "What is this? Some kind of revolt?" And the Duc de Rochefoucauld was like, "No, no, no, it's a revolution, sire." Right? Like, and he's like, "What?" I just, and so then the Bastille was toppled. Right? Like that. So I think those things have like something that you can't anticipate within the symbolic coordinates
Mhm.
happens, and then that would be the real. It's I think that the idea of symbolic failure is good, but it's also you can also think of it in terms of possibility and impossibility, right? Like the real is the impossible, but that can happen, right? So
Mhm.
we usually think impossible, it can't happen. But for Lacan, obviously there are things that are physically impossible, right? But his idea of the real is not that. It's things that are impossible within the symbolic structure that nonetheless can happen.
I think you explained that really well. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
So then talking more about the symbolic here, then when the subject is inaugurated into the symbolic, a common thought is that the subject always tries to fill the original unity they felt with the mother. This is very commonly thought. And as such, the inauguration into language is the mark of loss of this unity. However, it seems you, at least in enjoying what we don't have, it seems you reject this account as the whole reason the subject enters into the symbolic is due to the failure of this unity.
Right.
And I guess the question is twofold then. Would you say this is an accurate account of what you believe? And if so, what is the fundamental failure the subject feels that leads them to inaugurate themselves into language?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, you absolutely got it right. That is a common position. I reject it totally, and I think it's the product of the illusion retrospectively created by the fact that you're in the symbolic as a speaking being, right? Like that it seems like, wow, I'm a lacking being. There must have been some time when I felt completion and wholeness. That must have been before, when I was at the mother's breast or at someone's breast or with the bottle. My kid, I have twins, they never had a breast, they just had a bottle, but it's still like some kind of fullness of a thing. But the point is that that's just an illusion created by the symbolic. Now, your question, like why isn't that original relation fulfilling? Because there's every relation, precisely because it's not escaping the signifying structure. But I would even go further. I would say ontologic, like why does the signifier even emerge ever, right? Like there must be some kind of ontological failure, right? Like some kind of inadequacy or contradiction. You mentioned that book, Emancipation After Hegel. Like this is the point of that, in a certain way, the point of that book, like some contradiction fundamentally within the ontological structure that gives birth to language. But regardless, like the language it's always going to have this contradiction failure attached to it. And I do think, like, one way to think of it is the difference between loss and lack. I often will say loss just because I'm just talking, whatever. But I think if you think in terms of loss, it gives rise to this illusion that you mentioned. But I think if you think in terms of lack, you can lack without having lost something necessarily. Right?
So you would say that the subject is that is it. It's never united. It's never
united. Right. It's a subject of lack from the get-go.
Okay.
Right. And one way to think about it is the way that sometimes it's really hard to get the child to feed. Right. Like it doesn't want that. It does. You have to push it on there, and so I think to me that's like, wait a minute, I don't want this. There's not a unity. There's like I gotta force this child to take it in, right?
I think that's a good example.
Yeah.
So then, I guess this is perhaps shifting more and more into the symbolic realm. But for you, what's the link between language and subjectivity?
Yeah, very good. So there, it is precisely on the basis of language that we have subjectivity, right? Like if there was I don't think that there are subjects out that would be possible if there wasn't the discovery of language. So it's not like originally we have subjectivity, then we fall into language. This is kind of similar, related to the last question, right? Like there's no fall into language and lacking subjectivity. No, it's thanks to language that we have subjectivity in the first place, and that we have desires instead of needs, right? Like language, I think that's one of the crucial shifts that it imposes on us, is this shift from we just have basic needs, right? Instinctual needs. And then once you're a subject of language, you start to have unconscious desires, which are different.
And why is language important for political philosophy for you?
Well, just because of its distorting power, I think, right? Just because of what I just said. Like if you don't take language into account, then you're not taking the subject's desire into account, and I think this happens all the time, especially leftists, this attempt to appeal to the interest of subjects, right? Like, and then this comes back even to this death drive discussion that we had in the very beginning, right? Like if you're just appealing to people's self-interest, I don't think you're really appealing to them. And that's why I think these guys that you mentioned, these I wanted to call them masochists, but masculinists, which is funny because, of course, that's what I would think they are, but they don't think of themselves that way at all. But these masculinists, one of the reasons why they appeal is that they place unconscious desire or drive in the service of what appears like the pursuit of self-interest. But I think people that follow them, they know they're not just following their self-interest. And I think that's really that. If political thinking doesn't take into account that difference between self-interest and desire, then I think it's going to miss. It's not going to get appeal to people, right?
So in your book Enjoyment, Right and Left, you talk about Foucault, and you mention how there's this link between, I believe, the good and power.
Yeah.
Talking more about, I guess, Foucault here, what are the links to you between knowledge construction and power, if you're interested at all in that project?
Yeah, no, I could talk about that. Like, I think that, I think that I don't think he's wrong about that, about the way that knowledge ends up being implicated in a certain power structure. That seems right to me. I guess that what I would want to insist on is the category of truth, which I don't think Foucault, like for Foucault, truth is although the later Foucault's a little different, it's not exactly this, but that truth is just a part of the way the knowledge structure works, right? But I think that for psychoanalysis, for Hegel, for me, that truth is actually what cuts into knowledge and disturbs knowledge and undermines this knowledge power relation, even the power structure, right? And the whole apparatus of knowledge. So I think that would be if I'm going to always add these third terms like knowledge, power, and then I want to say, no, the truth is a different thing.
Right. So we've kind of discussed psychoanalysis. We've discussed how some more fundamental concepts of it. Yeah. What is the alternative that psychoanalysis provides us to the status quo that makes it so important for us to take it up as a project at all?
Yeah, do you mean alternative, like political alternative, or just
political alternative?
Yeah. Well, I think a couple things, but I think it's going to be ultimately disappointing, my answer, I'm afraid, because I don't think it provides an explicit political answer, and I think maybe that's a good thing. I mean, I think it's a good thing, but it provides a way of questioning the political structure that is different, I think, because and I think it shifts our way of thinking, and I think our political thinking is mostly focused around interest or around the good. And I do talk about this in that book that you mentioned, Enjoyment, Right and Left. But I think psychoanalysis precisely brings enjoyment, brings the unconscious into the picture, and it allows us to think like, wait a minute, is there a possibility for organizing society that isn't better? And I think this is hard to think through, right? Like it's not better, but it's in some way more satisfying, right? It's more, and I think this would be the best psychoanalytic answer that provides a better detour, or a more I don't know how to put it, a more economical or shorter detour to our satisfaction, right? Like that allows us to not to have more awareness of the way our enjoyment or satisfaction is structured, right? Like I think that's what psychoanalysis is trying to think through. But I don't think it's not like, oh, here's a clear political, here's how you should do it politically, right? Like I mean there's a sense in which Marxism doesn't even do that, right? Like Marx doesn't say, oh, here's A, B, C, or the political program. But I think psychoanalysis even less has this clear political program to it.
Would you identify with then, I believe it's a Lacanian author, he wrote his policy recommendation is to stop making policy recommendations.
Who said that? Do you know? I like that.
I think it might have been Lundberg, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Yeah. I don't think I can't think of a single theorist that's made a good policy. I mean, I don't think it's possible.
Do you think that like policy recommendations are kind of just like lie in the realm of just fantasy, or
Probably right. Yeah,
yeah.
that seems right to me. Yeah, they're just fantasies, and I think they. I mean, I think one thing that now speaking of fantasy, that seems like a way. Like one of the things psychoanalysis does is it says fantasy is really important. It's not just this, oh, dream about this thing that's never going to come about. Like it's actually the way that we structure our enjoyment. So I think it would say no, pay attention to your fantasies, but it can't prescribe the proper fantasy. So I do think that in a sense that's right. Like what's that person saying is don't prescribe fantasies, and that's what people are too much doing, I think, with the policy suggestions. Although, right, we have to make policies.
Yeah.
But I think the key thing is that the policy has to emerge out of the situation, right? Like it can't be this thing that comes out to us as a deus ex machina from some theorist who just is kind of speculating without a ground for speculating, because I don't think the theory offers you a way to say.
So that would be like the criticism of utopianism then, right? This idea that like
right. I think
it can't.
utopianism is interesting and useful as a theoretical
Uh-huh.
process, like a process. Like it gives. I like reading Thomas More. I like reading Charlotte Perkins Gilman, some of these utopian thinkers, for what they reveal about fantasy, right? But not because I think, oh, let's introduce this utopia. But I do think and I do think that's a problem with utopia. I'm going to say that, but I'm going to say I kind of miss the fact that they're only dystopian thinkers today and they're not utopian ones, right? Like I do think actually utopian fiction is a different kind of thing, right? Like it's an attempt to work out a certain fantasy and see how it would work. But I don't think that's the same as utopianism infecting the theory, right?
So then working within this frame of the fantasy, then one of the most popular terms, though I think only Lacan mentioned it once, I might be completely mistaken though, is traversing the fantasy.
Yeah.
Maybe you knew that was coming.
No, Amar, you're not mistaken at all. That's exactly right. One mention and it becomes this like mantra for people, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of amazing. He says it once, it's in seminar 11, and then it's like everybody says traversing the fantasy.
I think it just sounds cool.
It sounds cool, right? It does sound really cool. Yeah, I think I think there are people who thought that's the political solution, right? Like we traverse the fantasy and then we come to some utopia or at least some non-dystopia, let's call it. But I think the problem with that is that what Lacan means by traversing the fantasy is not what people think it means. Like they think it means you traverse something, you get beyond it, seemingly, right? But my friend Richard Boothby has this great line where he says, traversing the fantasy means being even more caught up in the fantasy than you previously were, right? So it doesn't mean getting beyond, it means actually like investing yourself. And I think this is actually one point where psychoanalysis provides a guide. Like it means investing yourself within the fantasy and recognizing the form of enjoyment that the fantasy offers, right? Like it's not offering us, let me just put it in these kind of approximate terms. It's not offering us plenitude, but it's offering us an ability that what we enjoy in the fantasy is precisely how our lack gets structured and formulated, right? But it's not this plenitude. And I think the greatest evidence for this is if you think about any fantasy you've gone through in your head, like there's an object of some sort, right? Like, I don't know, some kind of like let's just do a stupid fantasy of eating a piece of cake. Right? Like you have this object out there and you're fantasizing, but you never actually get to finish the cake. Like in the fantasy, that part's maybe you do, but it's uninteresting. The enjoyable part is when you're just at the moment of getting the cake, right? Or at the moment, all these preparatory things for getting the object, right? Like let's say you fantasize about a new job, you fantasize about all the things you got to do to get to that job. You don't fantasize about the the actual workaday grind of the job, right? And so I think that fantasy is about the limit or the barrier. And so traversing the fantasy doesn't mean traversing the barrier. It means actually recognizing that the limit or the barrier is the source of your enjoyment, right? And so so investing yourself even more in that limit or barrier obstacle. So I think that's the lesson. And that's why it's hard to transfer that into a political idea, right? Like, what would you say? Like, okay, we're going to set, I mean, look, I think there is a way in which you maybe could think about it in terms of climate. Like, we need to like enjoy a certain limit, right? Around our consumption. Maybe like there would be something you could do. I have some friends that are kind of thought and thinking those terms, but even there, I think once I'm not sure if that works, but that would be, I think, the closest thing. But I do think that's what traversing the fantasy means. It doesn't mean getting outside of it. It means in some way being more caught up in it and understanding how enjoyment gets deployed in that fantasy.
That for sure goes against like most interpretations of
actually totally
yeah.
True, right?
So I'm really happy to hear that this side of it. Yeah. Because
right, I should tell everyone that's a minority report, right?
Yeah.
It's not it's not the majority. Right?
Yeah.
But at least one other person thinks it. So Rick thinks it. So
I'll buy into it too. We can
okay,
all
great. That's cool. Yeah.
change the minority to the majority.
Yeah.
So you were talking about like the desiring of the cake, right? I think this is a pretty classic example. Insofar as that desire for the cake comes out of the other, right? Like
right.
Yeah.
Right. It's interesting because Freud has an example of something about his daughter's dream, Anna Freud's dream, and she dreams of strawberry cake, I think, or cake and straw, I forget. And his point is, for kids, their desire isn't mediated by the other, but that's totally wrong because like it's totally mediated by the other because why does she desire this cake that's forbidden? Like your kids don't get to eat cake. If they did, they wouldn't enjoy it like they do. They don't get to eat cake all the time, every day. So she dreams about this thing that is precisely forbidden by the other, right? So it's mediated by the big other. And I think that happens. Cake, that's true of certain kind of obviously sexual relations. That's true of, right? Like they're for like no one fantasizes about the person that's like begging to have sex with them, right? Like people don't fantasize about that. They fantasize about the person that they can't have sex with, right? But they're looking at they see in class or they see at work and they're just like, oh, I long for them, and then they fantasize, but they don't. Not the person that's always accessible to them, right?
And precisely, I think this plays really well into this whole idea because they fantasize about them sleeping with them and like wanting it so desperately, but as soon as you get that, you don't want it.
No, right. It would be just a banal, ordinary sexual. It's fine, like sexual encounter. It's nice, but it loses precisely this sublime status that it had in the fantasy, right?
Yeah,
right. Absolutely.
And then one last question, because I imagine you're tired, because I believe you just came back from the Theory Underground.
I did just do
so I imagine you're one last thing. I wanted to touch on one really popular criticism of psychoanalysis.
Okay.
It comes from an audience who claim that psychoanalysis is unfalsifiable and thus unscientific. Despite this, it is the author Popper, despite this, it seems apparent in the psychoses and the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis that Lacan himself believes that it's a science, psychoanalysis. Now, some proponents of psychoanalysis have argued back by claiming that it is indeed falsifiable, while others will claim that falsifiability is a bad standard to begin with. So where do you stand on that, and do you think psychoanalysis is truly a science?
Not a science. No,
not a science at all.
No, I think it's a philosophy. I don't think it's a science. I think it's a kind of way of doing. It's a version of to me, of German idealism, dialectical thinking. That's just what it is, and there's a practice attached to that. But it's a philosophy. To my mind, it's not a science. But this falsifiability question, I think, is really an interesting one, isn't it? Like what do you do with that? Because I think in a certain way, it's not a wrong accusation by Popper. Popper he's a total bad faith reader of everyone he attacks, right? Like his attack on Plato is total bad faith. his attack on Hegel and Marx is completely, it's the worst possible reading. It doesn't even make any sense. He accuses Hegel of being a German nationalist. He's the farthest thing from that. It's absurd, right? So bad faith reading. But what's I think really interesting about that is that my idea would be maybe every theory is unfalsifiable, right? So yes, it's true of psychoanalysis, but is there a theory that's a real theory of things that's not true of? No, I think that's true of every theory. And what happens is something comes that falsifies it. It says, oh, this is exception, right? This exception, this exception, this exception to the rule. And then the theory topples and we get a new theory, right? Like I think that's exactly Thomas Kuhn, you know this book, Structure of Scientific Revolutions? Yeah. I think that's exactly Kuhn's theory, right? Like that all of a sudden I think it's an aesthetic idea of how revolutions happen, right? Like there's too many exceptions. That's what happened to part of the problem with I think the astronomical theories are the clearest, right? Like, so for one thing, there are two competing theories. There's Aristotelian theory and there's a Ptolemaic theory, right? That were both geocentric, Earth in the center. And then all of a sudden they were at odds with each other. And then they both had wait a minute, when the stars move this way, that's because this one star, that's the sphere is this. So there are little changes, little problems. And then Copernicus came along, and then he offers a little bit of better explanation, but it's really Galileo who says, okay, we can explain this in a much more aesthetically pleasing and coherent way, right? And so and Kuhn's point is that's what makes a revolution happen in science. So it's not, but within that earlier system, it wasn't false. It got contrary results. It wasn't falsified, right? It just, they just fit in. They didn't fit well, but they fit in. And I think that's true of every theory. But Freud is a little more interesting, right? Because this idea of the unconscious, that's what I think really got to Popper, right? Like it got to him, that because he thought, well, that's bullshit. Because you can always, I say something to you, like I say, wait a minute, that's you're just totally wrong about that. And then you can say to me back, well, no, you're just saying I'm wrong because it's your unconscious desire, and it's not really what you think. And he said, oh, wait a minute, that's ridiculous. You can't always, and I think there's something to that, right? Like there's something to this always, and I think the problem is that as a psychoanalytic thinker, you're saying something, you're making a claim, and someone could always come back to you and just say, well, it's your unconscious that's making you even endorse psychoanalysis itself, right? So I do think it's a little bit of a conundrum or a paradox of psychoanalysis itself, right? Like that it's trying to claim that the unconscious is the ultimate trump, right? It's funny to say that name now, but my parents played bridge and they taught me to play bridge when I was a little boy, so I always used trump in this metaphorical way. But it's the ultimate trump card, right? Like the unconscious, but it's not just a trump card. It's like, I mean, it is a trump. It really does trump everything. And if you think that, then I think it means that your theory is always going to be tenuous, right? So in a way, maybe Popper's right, but then maybe he's 180 degrees incorrect, because it's psychoanalysis is the one theory that says every claim is tenuous, like every claim is beset by the unconscious trouble, right? Like, and you're always struggling with that problem of, wait a minute, I'm making a claim, but my own unconscious is, and the structure of the unconscious is undermining that, right? So I think I do register that, again, I'm anti-Popperian in every kind of way, but I think he does put his finger on something. But I think, so I talked in circles on this, but I think my ultimate claim is that psychoanalysis maybe is more receptive to the trouble or the falsifiability problem than anything else. And I think that he doesn't really understand how analysis works, right? Because isn't analysis, it's not, this comes back to this idea from Freud that the secret to your own dream, right? Like that you can't, you don't, you don't tell the analyst doesn't say, oh wait, I see that's where your unconscious is in the dream. The analyst gets you to talk, and you have to recognize that's the kernel of truth in my dream. Like if you don't, and this is why Freud thinks there's no suggestion in psychoanalysis. This is how he thinks there's no suggestion, because if, let's say I try to convince you, wait a minute, you're in love with your mother. Let's just do some stupid psychoanalytic thing, right? And I try to convince you of it. And you're like, you know what? Dadgummit, you convinced me, right? You would use the stupid old time slang, but you're like, you convinced me. And then Popper would say, haha, see, psychoanalysis doesn't even give you a chance. It can't be falsifiable. It just imposes this interpretation. But Freud would say, why did you accept it? Right? Like he would say, that's why there's no suggestion, because there has to be this point of subjectivity where you go, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Right. And he that's why I think that there's the falsifiability there too for the psychoanalytic reading. Right. You can always say, no, that's wrong. And Freud was very sensitive to that. Freud thought, if I offer an interpretation to someone and they're like, that's uninteresting, he'd say, okay, let's just go on to something else. But if they're like, oh my God, that can't be it, then he's like, well, wait a minute, let's think about that.
Yeah.
Right. So I think there is falsifiability actually in the application of the theory. But there's I think there's no falsifiability for a theory as such. But in the way that I think the thing that annoyed Popper, I think there is actually falsifiability. Like you can just be wrong as an analyst. Freud said it all the time. Like, I tried this interpretation, it was wrong, I went on to a different.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Does that
that was
together?
No, that was very poignant. I like that a lot, and I think that links everything together. Thank you so much for coming on today. I had a lot of questions. You were able to give them in quite a fast pace that were very comprehensible. I think that a lot of things that Lacanians tend to struggle with is using a lot of that language, and then that becomes like an impasse for a lot of people.
Yeah, jargon's terrible. I agree, and it's a Lacanian problem. So that's why I don't really call myself Lacanian, because I don't like jargon. So yeah. Okay. Hey, Mar, it was great to see you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for
Take
having
care.
me on. Yeah, I appreciate it. Take care.